And what I wanted to do now is talk about radiation detection devices. And radiation detection devices, there are several. You have an ionization chamber, you have Geiger counters, you have scintillation counters, and thermoluminescent dosimeters. And I wanted to go through these a little bit and tell you about some of the applications that they have. The first is ionization chambers. And what an ionization chamber will do is set up a system where you can create and measure ion pairs. And most Geiger counters, which I'll show a picture of next, are going to have a ionization chamber that is a part of them where you'll have something inside. Usually it's sealed air. You'll expose it to ionizing radiation. And if the air is ionized, it can go from one positive charge to one plate, the negative charge to another. That'll set up a current imbalance, and you can actually measure that. And therefore, you can use an ionization chamber to measure the amount of ion pairs that are produced. It's a picture of a Geiger counter. Geiger counter is a handheld ionization chamber, essentially. You can change the probe to measure alpha, beta for particulate or for gamma. And it makes, you probably have seen these in movies or maybe even used one before. It makes clicking sounds, and you can then determine how much ionizing radiation is present. But what it's measuring is how many ion pairs are being produced in a sealed chamber of air by exposure to ionizing radiation. And it will then quantify that against how much ionizing radiation is present. The next type is a scintillation counter. And we were talking on Tuesday about carbon-14 dating, where the carbon-14 dating can basically determine when you had your last meal, because dead people don't eat. And you can go back in time and determine when the last time that person was exposed to any carbon material through ingestion, and that got into their bones. In order to do that, you need to use scientific equipment that's able to measure very, very, very low levels of ionizing radiation. And scintillation counters can do this. This is mainly a scientific research tool, but if you're going to be working in a hospital or you're going to be working in a university where people are doing research using radioisotopes, you'll find these that are pretty prevalent. Some places I've worked, you walk down a hall and there's scintillation counters every 2 feet. They're that prevalent, and therefore a lot of people are using radioisotopes. And they're very useful for measuring extremely low levels. And for measuring if someone's been working with a radioisotope, you can swab that area, throw the swab into a scintillation counter, and determine if there's any detectable radioactivity in that particular work area. The next is a thermoluminescent dosimeter, TLD. And these are used quite a bit around people that are exposed to low levels of ionizing radiation. If you are working in a doctor's office, if you're working at the USEC area, or places where ionizing radiation is present, this can determine what your annual exposures are going to be. So a TLD will be something that you'll send in to the radiation office at a periodic time frame, maybe 6 months or annually, that will determine what your dose is. And so these are basically radiation badges that can determine what exposure is going to be over extended periods of time. So those are a few of the radiation measurement devices. Now the next part is how much radiation are you exposed to? Just by being alive, we're going to be exposed to ionizing radiation. It's part of our natural background. And so things that we do, where we walk, what we eat, are all going to be components in our total dosage of ionizing radiation. In addition, if you work in certain areas, a technology area, if you work in medicine or if you work in research, your chances are going to be exposed are a little bit greater. And also, some parts of the country where you have geological formations where you may have some uranium byproducts present, and your ventilation system is such where it can build up in your home, you may have radon exposure. And radon is an alpha emitter that we talked about on Tuesday, which is the bowling ball, and can do quite a bit of internal damage if you happen to be exposed to it. Now, what kind of exposures are you going to get from these sources? Your annual dose is going to be about 175 millirems per year, but that's going to be a composition of all these other types of exposures, the most of which is typically for a normal person medical. And that's going to vary year to year. You may not have a chest x-ray some years. You may not go to the dentist and have your teeth x-rayed, but that's kind of an average. But the other ones, terrestrial stuff that's in the dirt, that's where your uranium byproducts are going to be. Cosmic, that's going to be the rays from outer space that have ultraviolet and high energy ionizing radiation. And internally, we're going to be eating a certain amount of potassium 40 and carbon 14 in everything we consume. It's not a lot. It's not enough to cause any health issues, but at the same time, if they dig up your bones in 2 million years, they can still detect how much carbon 14 is in your body because of the fact that you've been eating it throughout your lifespan. Again, it's a small dose, but it's going to be detectable for a long period of time. Because the half-life of carbon-14 is over 8,000 years. So after 8,000 years, half of it's left, and after another 8,000 years, half of it's left. So you can use this technique at a long period of time depending upon how good your detection devices are. Now the next part that I wanted to talk about is what can ionizing radiation do to you? Why are we worried about it? And that encompasses some of the biological consequences. The couple points that I want to make about this is that all of the effects of ionizing radiation are due to ion pairs. And ion pairs are very dangerous when they occur within a biological system. And what will happen ultimately that can make this so dangerous is that it can destroy the capacity of the cell to reproduce or cause a cell to mutate. So ion pair formation can be directly related to some hazardous things that can occur within the cells. And the dose of ionizing radiation is going to vary as well in the time frame. If you have the same dose that's spread out over many years, it's not going to be nearly the same consequences as if you have it all at once. And so a given total dose will cause more damage if given in a shorter period of time. Now, how's all this kind of work in terms of the ion pairs and what happens? This is normal cell replication. You're doing this all the time. I talked about what's going on with your skin. You get a new you every month from the new layers of skin that are constantly being formed. It happens to most of the cells in your body. Your blood cells last about a month, maybe 6 weeks. So you're constantly getting a new supply of red blood cells and white blood cells and platelets. The lining of your GI tract is kind of like your skin. It's going to be there for 2 weeks or so, and it's constantly being replenished. So you're having new cells that are produced all the time. And they go through this process. If you have a parent cell, it divides, and you have two daughter cells that are identical to the parent cell. And this, again, is occurring in all of us as we speak, millions and millions and millions of times right here as we're sitting. Now, if you have ionizing radiation present, what will occur is that cell division that normally takes place is not going to happen. Something is going to occur that prevents the daughter cell, the parent cell, from replicating properly. And at the end of the process, what you have are cells that aren't like the parent cell. They're either damaged, they're dead, or they're incapable of reproducing properly. So you have the cellular replication process that has been undermined by ionizing radiation, and I'll get into some details of that in a couple of minutes. Now, what are some of the biological consequences that can occur? Well, I think this is kind of interesting. We have a lot of atoms in our body and a lot of cellular replication that's occurring. If you are exposed to a fatal dose of ionizing radiation, about 600 rads, and I'll get into what a rad versus a rim and some of the other measurements are a little bit later, you're not going to really note much that's happened to you. The temperature rise, it's energy, but it's going to be basically less than most thermometers detect. You know, your temperature normally is 98.6, and if it's 98.6001, most thermometers aren't going to be picking that up. And yet you've received a fatal dose of ionizing radiation. And if you hear the odds of winning Powerball are 1 in 100 million, you're going to think a little bit about whether or not you want to spend $1 on that particular ticket. But in ionizing radiation, that's enough to kill you. All you have to do is cause ionization in one atom in 100 million, and that can be lethal. And that's because we have trillions and trillions of cells. And if you get damage of 1 in 100 million, it doesn't sound like a lot, but it actually is, and it's enough to cause death. The other thing about biological consequences is they're the same for all types of ionizing radiation. It's just limited. Some of them have different ion pair production. X-rays are very narrow and limited. It's a focused beam. I told you in class the other day, think of that as a BB. A beta particle has particulate, is a particle. It has mass. It's a high-speed electron. It's kind of like a baseball going through you. So it has more ion pair production. It does a little bit more damage. And an alpha particle is huge. It's a helium nucleus. It's 2 protons and 2 neutrons. It's like a bowling ball, and it can create a lot of ion pairs and do quite a bit of damage. But the effects are going to be identical. It's just going to be the magnitude of the effects based upon how much ionizing radiation you are hit with. But it's all ion pair production. They all produce ion pairs, and they all do the same thing. Now, what kind of health effects can happen from ion pair productions? Well, one thing that can happen is the ion pairs can occur at a critical target, like DNA. If you hit DNA with ionizing radiation and create an ion pair in DNA directly, the DNA is not going to replicate properly. So you can get a direct hit on DNA. That's going to be unusual if you get a direct hit on DNA. Most of the time, what's going to occur is you're going to get a direct hit on a secondary source via a free radical, and the free radical is going to cause a chain reaction that will ultimately affect DNA. And this can occur because free radical production is really, really prevalent with ionizing radiation. The next slide is kind of a busy slide. It tells you really what I got my doctoral degree in. I spent a lot of time trapping many of these species in many types of situations for toxicity. But most of our body is what? Water. And if you hit water with ionizing radiation, that's bad. Because what will happen, and what this is emphasizing, is water can be broken apart by ionizing radiation and create all of these different species down here, some of which are known to be the most potent biological oxidants found. So if you hit water with ionizing radiation, one of the things that it can form is this baby here, which I have kind of circled, the hydroxyl radical. It's next to this one called free radical formation. The hydroxyl radical is going to react within 5 to 10 molecular diameters of anything it's in contact with. So if it's hit by ionizing radiation and it happens to be near DNA, you don't have to hit the DNA directly. If you hit the water and it breaks apart and forms a hydroxyl radical, that hydroxyl radical is going to hit the DNA, and that's going to be just as bad as if you hit it directly. Alternatively, if you miss it, you can create a lot of these other species that can travel, like hydrogen peroxide. It can travel from point A to point B. Then it can break into hydroxyl radical and still cause the same problem. So when you hit water with ionizing radiation, you can create what's called a whole chain reaction of multiple species of free radicals that are very, very dangerous, that can in turn hit critical targets. So that's one of the reasons it's so dangerous. All it has to do is hit water, and the water has to be in contact with a critical target, and that's going to be just as bad as hitting the DNA directly. And this is just a slide of a lot of different types of free radicals. Now, what's going to happen to you if you get hit with ionizing radiation? Well, you have some critical organs, and those are the ones that I was discussing a little bit earlier that are constantly producing new cells. And if the ones that are constantly producing new cells are hit with ionizing radiation, they're going to be very, very susceptible to some of the effects. Let's look at a couple of specific effects. Let's look at blood cells. Now, if you hit the bone marrow, and you hit the blood cells in the bone marrow, you have really three main, if you know much about how your blood cells are formed, they start with a parent cell. And that parent cell is going to divide and become three major lines of blood cells that each have their own little subspecies. But the major lines that come out of the one parent in your bone marrow are your red blood cells, your white blood cells, and your platelets. Now, what's going to occur if you hit bone marrow is that you're no longer going to be able to produce your red blood cells, your white blood cells, and your platelets. Now, say you're hit with a fatal dose of ionizing radiation. Essentially, the ability to produce these cells is going to be shut down. So you're not going to die right away. You're probably going to feel fine for a little while. But then the effects of ionizing radiation are going to start to kick in. I've seen a couple of movies and a TV show that did this really well. The one that I'll bring up is 24, a couple seasons ago, where George Mason was fighting some terrorists and got hit with a fatal dose of ionizing radiation. And he was all proud of himself afterwards and went back to his team, and they said, well, we got some bad news. And they said, what's that? And they said, well, you were in there in this area, and we measured the radiation levels, and it's a fatal dose. You're not going to survive this. And really? Yeah. And they really did this well. And they said, what's going to happen is you're going to start feeling effects from the blood cells. And they went through this in quite a bit of detail. They said, your red blood cells have been knocked out. Well, what's going to happen if your red blood cells are knocked out? You use your red blood cells to carry oxygen. So if you can't carry an adequate amount of oxygen, you're going to get a condition called anemia. And if you have anemia, then you're going to start getting symptoms of anemia, which is going to be fatigue. You're going to be really, really tired because you can't meet the body's oxygen demands. So this will lead to anemia. If you don't have white blood cells, the things that the white blood cells are doing are going to be compromised. And so as you start to lose your pool of white blood cells, anything that's going around you're going to get. You cannot fight off the infection, because one of the things the white blood cells does is it helps fight off any infectious agents. So anything that's going around that ordinarily would not be dangerous, you could get very, very sick from. So you're going to get infections. And platelets provide your clotting factors. So if you go and you bruise yourself, you get a bruise, you're not going to die from the small bruise, because you have clotting factors that are going to seal that plug. Once your platelets are gone, then you're going to become essentially a hemophiliac. And so anything that could jar your body, that would be a minor injury that normally the clotting factors would stop the bleeding, it's not going to stop. And so you can essentially bleed to death. So this has the bleeding will occur. And that's just from the red blood cells. There are other cells that ionizing radiation can hit as well. It can hit the gastrointestinal tract. If you've ever been food poisoned, you've had that gastrointestinal tract slough off. That's the kind of symptoms that can occur from ionizing radiation. It won't be repaired, so nausea, diarrhea, extreme sickness in the stomach are going to occur. The reproductive tissue are very susceptible to it as well. So anything that's a fast-growing cell is going to be affected by ionizing radiation because it cannot be replenished. The central nervous system is actually pretty resistant. You don't have a lot of cell growth in the central nervous system. If you have spinal cord injury, it's very difficult to repair because it's extremely, extremely slow growing. So again, if you are hit with a high dose, you're not going to feel it or know it because your CNS is pretty resistant to it. But as you start trying to replenish the cells that you're using, they're not going to be replenished, and so it's a process that will take a while for acutely lethal doses. Now, for chronic doses, over time, for chronic effects, you can have several different types of health effects occur. And in the populations that have been exposed to ionizing radiation and have been studied quite a bit, have noted some of the health effects that are listed here. For example, the people who were in the atomic bomb area in Hiroshima and Nagasaki were studied fairly extensively, as well as many other people that have been exposed to high levels of ionizing radiation. And cancers of all types are elevated. And this is because of when you alter cell division, then you can have the possibility that the cell's going to replicate abnormally, and that can lead to the carcinogenic process. Many of the early radiation workers died from leukemia because it's very susceptible to effects on the blood. And so if you have improper replication of the white blood cells, you can get the condition of leukemia. Madame Curie, who the Curie is named after, died of leukemia. Her husband, Pierre, did not. He probably would have he survived. If you've ever, I have a little link about the Curie up on Blackboard for the Curie's up on Blackboard for you to read. She's really a remarkable woman. If you look at her life story, which I'd encourage you to read, it's pretty amazing because she was widowed at a young age and she refused any type of assistance from anybody. Raised kids on her own while she was a scientist in a man's world at that time. So she was, really just a remarkable woman. But her husband was a brilliant man who they worked together in their early careers, and he was the kind of guy who would be working on a project and his mind would be so consumed with that project that he wouldn't think about anything else in the outside world. And he actually died because he stepped in front of a horse-drawn carriage carrying military uniforms and was trampled to death. And what was surprising is that everybody that knew him, they weren't surprised. It was like, well, you know, we always expected him to not look two ways before he crossed the street. He was that kind of a personality. Very brilliant in some areas, but kind of lost in others. And then a lot of the early workers in the ionizing radiation field developed cataracts. And they developed cataracts because the lens of your eye is a crystalline protein, very much like an egg white. And if you take an egg and you expose it to energy like heat, it's going to turn opaque. And that's the same thing that happens with a crystalline lens in your eye. If you take a crystalline lens, you expose it to energy in the form of ionizing radiation, it becomes opaque, which is what cataracts are. Ionizing radiation can also lead to sterility and birth defects. Many people who are treated for cancer at young ages have a long-term effect of sterility because the chemotherapeutic agents as well as ionizing radiation both target fast-growing cells, and so one of the side effects can potentially be sterility from ionizing radiation. The developing fetus, if hit during organogenesis, is going to be susceptible to abnormal development, so it can cause birth defects as well. And the other effect of ionizing radiation, which has been consistent among many studies, especially in survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, is they just don't live as long. You have a life-shortening effect, and there are theories on why that may occur, but it does have the effect of shortening life. And the next section is on radiation protection, and I'm running out of time, so I think this is a good point to pause, and I'll just finish up the radiation protection on Thursday.